My boss humiliated me in front of 30 of my coworkers, called me disposable, and told me I'd never amount to anything more than a guy who fills out spreadsheets for people smarter than me. What he didn't know, standing there in his $1,100 suit, smiling like he'd just won something, was that in 6 weeks I'd be the one signing his termination letter. He didn't know about the interview I'd already had. He didn't know what was sitting in my inbox that morning. And he definitely didn't know that the woman he'd been lying to for 2 years was about to walk into that building and ask to see me first. Before I get into what happened, if you're the kind of person who believes karma eventually finds its way home, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because this channel is built for people exactly like you. And while I tell you this one, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. I always like picturing that: somebody folding laundry in Ohio, somebody driving home in Texas, somebody just getting off a night shift in California, all of us sharing the same 15 minutes. All right, let's go back to the beginning, because you need to understand who I was before you'll understand what I became. My name is Daniel Reyes. I was 34 years old when this all started, though I feel like I aged 5 years in the 6 months it took to unfold. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a 2-bedroom rental with my mother, Elena, who waited tables at a diner off Route 4 for 26 years. My father left when I was 4, and I don't remember much about him except that he had a laugh you could hear from the parking lot. My mother worked doubles on Christmas, so we'd have something under the tree, and she used to tell me that the world doesn't owe you a promotion, it only owes you a chance to prove yourself, and what you do with that chance is on you. I believed her. I still do, actually, even after everything. I put myself through community college, taking night classes in business administration while working mornings at a warehouse. And by the time I was 26, I'd landed a job as an operations coordinator at Whitfield Distribution, a mid-sized logistics company out of Columbus that moved freight for retail chains across 3 states. It wasn't glamorous. I tracked shipments, managed vendor contracts, fixed problems nobody else wanted to touch at 2 in the morning when a truck broke down outside Toledo. But I was good at it, and for the first 4 years, I had a regional director named Frank Delgado who noticed. Frank was the kind of boss you don't forget. He'd stop by my desk on a Friday and ask about my mother by name. He taught me how to read a shipping contract the way a lawyer would, looking for the sentence that could cost the company $40,000 if nobody caught it. He used to say, "Reyes, you've got the instincts, you just don't know it yet." I remember winter, our biggest client threatened to walk over a missed delivery window, and Frank stayed on the phone with me until nearly midnight, not to solve it for me, but to walk me through solving it myself, step by step, so that the next time it happened, I wouldn't need him at all. That was the kind of manager he was. He built people up on purpose, the way some men build furniture, patiently, and without needing anyone to watch him do it. Frank retired the year I turned 30, and at his goodbye lunch, he pulled me aside and said he'd put in a word with corporate that I should be considered for his replacement someday. I remember driving home that night, feeling like the future had finally introduced itself to me. Windows down, even though it was October and too cold for that, just because I wanted to feel something other than the inside of my own car. It didn't work out that way. Corporate brought in an outside hire instead, a man named Gary Holloway, 53 years old, who'd spent the last decade at a competing firm in Cincinnati before that company folded under a cloud of lawsuits nobody at Whitfield seemed to want to discuss too loudly. Gary walked into our office on his first day wearing cufflinks shaped like tiny anchors and told the entire floor that he believed in lean teams and clear hierarchies, which within a month turned out to mean that he believed in taking credit and assigning blame, usually in that order. At first, it wasn't obvious. Gary was charming in meetings, the kind of charming that made executives from headquarters laugh a little too hard at his jokes. He called me Danny Boy the first week, which I hated, but I let it go because I told myself I needed to give the man a chance. My mother raised me to believe that respect is something you extend first and only withdraw when it's been earned to be withdrawn, so I extended it. I stayed late helping him understand a supply chain system that had taken me 4 years to master. I covered for him twice when he missed conference calls with our biggest client, a home goods chain called Bramwell & Co., because he'd been at his lake house and lost track of the time zone difference. The first real betrayal came about 8 months into his tenure. I'd spent 3 weekends building a cost reduction proposal, rerouting 2 of our regional trucking lanes to cut fuel costs and consolidate warehouse space, something that would save the company almost $300,000 a year. I brought it to Gary on a Tuesday morning, walked him through every spreadsheet, every projection. He nodded along, asked good questions, told me it was solid work, Danny boy, really solid. 2 weeks later, I sat in the regional all-hands meeting and watched Gary present my exact proposal to 6 vice presidents flown in from headquarters without once saying my name. He called it a strategic vision I'd been developing since I got here. The room applauded. Somebody from corporate said they were going to fast-track him for a national operations role. I sat in the back row with my laptop open to the original file, time-stamped 6 weeks before Gary had ever mentioned it, and I said nothing, because I told myself that speaking up in that room would make me look bitter instead of right. That night, I called my mother and told her what happened, and she was quiet for a second before she said, "Write it down, Danny, everything. Dates, times, what he said, what you said. Not because you're planning revenge, because someday you might need to remember the truth better than he does." I didn't know yet how important that would become. But I started a private folder that night, and I never stopped adding to it. The red flags kept coming after that. Gary began rooting me around instead of through, assigning tasks to a junior analyst named Tyler, who happened to be his sister's son, work that used to come straight to me. He'd correct me in meetings on details he clearly didn't understand himself, just to make sure everyone in the room saw him managing me. Once, in front of a client from Bramwell & Co., he referred to me as our logistics guy, not by name, like I was a job title instead of a person who'd built half the systems keeping their shipments on time. I let it slide because I needed the job, because my mother's health had started to decline that year, and because I told myself patience was still the right play. There was a Tuesday that fall I still think about sometimes. A shipment of home goods bound for 3 Bramwell stores in Michigan got rerouted through the wrong hub because of a scheduling error. And it wasn't my error, it wasn't even Tyler's. It was a mistake buried in a spreadsheet Gary himself had approved without reading it closely. The client called furious. Gary walked straight to my desk in front of half the floor and said, loud enough for people 2 rows over to hear, "This is exactly the kind of thing that happens when I can't trust my team to double-check the basics." I fixed it within the hour, rerouted the checks myself, called the client, and smoothed it over personally. Gary never apologized. He never even acknowledged it had been his approval on the file. Marcus told me afterward he'd seen the original email chain and knew exactly whose mistake it was, and he asked me why I didn't just show it to Gary's boss. I told him I was still trying to believe that doing good work quietly would eventually be its own defense. Looking back, I understand now how long that belief cost me. Little things kept stacking on top of each other that winter. Gary started scheduling one-on-one check-ins with everyone on the team except me, as if my 9 years of history somehow meant I needed less attention rather than more respect. He'd forward client emails to Tyler for a first review before they ever reached me, even on accounts I'd managed since before Tyler had finished college. At the holiday party that December, Gary gave a toast thanking the people who really carry this office and named 4 people, none of them me, while I stood near the back with a plastic cup of cheap wine, watching my mother's voice in my head remind me that patience isn't the same thing as invisibility, though at the time I couldn't yet tell the difference. Then came the second betrayal, and this one cut deeper because it wasn't just professional, it was personal. There was an opening for assistant regional director, the position Frank had once told me I should be groomed for. I'd been at the company 9 years by then. I applied, prepared for 2 weeks, walked into that interview with a portfolio that documented every project I'd led, every dollar I'd saved the company, every late night I'd spent solving problems that weren't technically mine to solve. Gary sat across from me during that interview and asked me questions like he'd never met me before in his life. A week later, the job went to Tyler, 26 years old, 18 months of experience. Gary's nephew. I found out through a company-wide email, the kind that says, "Please join us in congratulating," and I remember sitting at my desk reading it twice, because some part of me thought I'd misread a name. My coworker, Marcus Webb, who sat 2 desks over and had become one of the only people at that company I trusted, came by afterward and just said, "You know, this isn't right, Reyes." I told him I knew. I didn't tell him how much it hurt, because some pain you keep folded up small enough that it fits in your pocket and doesn't show on your face. The emotional weight of that period is hard to describe unless you've lived through something like it. You start to question whether you're actually as good as you think you are, whether the years of effort meant anything, whether the world really does just belong to people who golf with the right people. I started losing sleep. I started snapping at my mother on the phone over nothing, then apologizing an hour later. I remember standing in my kitchen at 1 in the morning, staring at a cost report I didn't need to be looking at, just because I couldn't sit still with my own thoughts. I stopped telling people outside of work what was happening because I got tired of the look on their faces, that mix of sympathy and quiet relief that it wasn't happening to them. Even Marcus, who I trusted more than almost anyone in that building, only got the edited version. I told him about Tyler getting the promotion. I didn't tell him that I'd started keeping a change of clothes in my car so I could sit in a parking lot after work some nights and just breathe before I had to walk into my mother's house and pretend I was fine. She was managing a health scare of her own that year, nothing I want to go into detail about, but enough that I didn't want to add my own disappointment to what she was already carrying. So I smiled at her kitchen table and complained about traffic instead of the truth. I think now that she probably saw straight through it the whole time, the way mothers usually do, and let me have the lie because I needed it more than she needed the truth. And then, just when I'd started quietly updating my resume, something happened that gave me false hope, and looking back, I think that's exactly what made the following months so brutal. Corporate announced that Whitfield Distribution was being acquired by a larger logistics company called National Crestpoint, headquartered out of Chicago. The announcement came with the usual language: no immediate changes expected, committed to our valued employees, the kind of corporate reassurance that means almost nothing and yet somehow still makes you hope. I remember thinking maybe this is it. Maybe new ownership means a fresh look at who's actually doing the work around here. Maybe somebody from outside, somebody who doesn't play golf with Gary Holloway, will finally see what I've built. I want you to sit with that hope for a second because it's important. Hope, when it's misplaced, doesn't just disappoint you, it makes the fall afterward hurt twice as much. Because 3 weeks after that acquisition announcement, Gary called me into his office on a Thursday afternoon, closed the door, and told me that due to restructuring efficiencies, my position was being eliminated, effective in 2 weeks. He said it flatly, checking his phone twice while he said it, like he was reading me the weather. He said there'd be a small severance package, and that Tyler would be absorbing my responsibilities to streamline the transition. I want to be honest with you. I sat in that chair and felt something in me go completely still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. 9 years. Every late night, every proposal Gary took credit for, every problem I'd solved without being asked. And it ended with a man checking his phone while he fired me to make room for his nephew. I asked him one question before I left that office. I said, "Does corporate know this is why I'm actually being let go?" And Gary looked at me, smiled that same smile from the anchor cufflinks day, and said, "Corporate knows what I tell them, Danny boy." That sentence stayed with me for a long time. If you've ever been pushed out of somewhere you gave everything to, you understand there's a specific kind of grief in it, different from other kinds of loss. It's grief for a version of yourself that believed things worked a certain way. I went home that night and told my mother, and she didn't say anything about being strong or staying positive. She just said, "Sit with it tonight. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what's next." That's the kind of mother she was. She never rushed my pain, and I never rushed hers. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something because I'm curious. If you were in my position, 9 years of loyalty, watched your work get stolen twice, and then fired to protect somebody's nephew, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have fought it, walked away quietly, or started planning? Drop your answer in the comments because I read every single one, and some of your stories from past videos have genuinely stayed with me longer than you'd think. Here's what actually happened. About 4 months before all of this, on Frank Delgado's recommendation, I quietly applied for an operations leadership certification program run in partnership with National Crestpoint, the same company that was now acquiring Whitfield. I hadn't told anyone at work, not even Marcus, because I didn't want it getting back to Gary and getting him another reason to push me out early. I'd been doing the coursework at night on weekends, the same way I put myself through college years earlier. 2 weeks before Gary fired me, I'd finished a final case study project for that program. Ironically, a full operational audit and restructuring plan for a mid-sized logistics branch, built using anonymized data, though anyone who actually knew our numbers would have recognized exactly which company it was modeled on. A woman named Renata Cole, National Crestpoint's Vice President of Regional Operations, had reviewed that project personally. She reached out to me the same week Gary fired me. She didn't know yet that I'd lost my job. The timing was pure coincidence, though I've thought about that coincidence more times than I can count. She said my case study had impressed the executive committee, that it was, in her words, the most thorough and realistic restructuring plan they'd reviewed all year, and she wanted to talk to me about a role helping oversee operational integration for the branches Crestpoint was acquiring. One of those branches, she mentioned almost in passing, was a Columbus location currently run by a director named Gary Holloway. I sat in my car in a parking lot after that phone call for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home. I didn't tell my mother right away. I didn't tell Marcus. I went through 3 rounds of interviews with Crestpoint over the next month. All of it happening quietly, all of it happening while Gary believed I'd simply been erased from his life. During my final interview, I told Renata Cole the truth, that the company being described in my hypothetical case study was, in fact, the company that had just fired me, and that the restructuring plan I'd built wasn't hypothetical at all. It was real, it was documented, and I had every date, every email, every proposal Gary had claimed as his own sitting in a folder I'd been keeping since the night my mother told me to write it all down. Renata didn't say much in that moment. She just asked me to send her everything I had. I want to pause here and tell you, this wasn't about revenge for the sake of revenge. I never once considered doing anything dishonest, anything that would have gotten me in trouble or hurt someone who didn't deserve it. What I had was the truth, documented, dated, and real. And sometimes the truth is the most devastating weapon a person can hand you because nobody can argue with a timestamp. 3 weeks later, I accepted a position as Senior Director of Regional Operations for National Crestpoint's Midwest Division. My first assignment, according to the transition paperwork Renata handed me personally, was overseeing the operational audit and leadership evaluation of 3 acquired branches, one of which was the Columbus branch of what used to be Whitfield Distribution, the same branch, the same office, the same man. I didn't tell anyone at my old office what had happened. Marcus texted me twice over those weeks, just checking in, and I told him only that I'd landed on my feet somewhere good, nothing more. I wanted the moment to speak for itself when it came, not because I wanted to embarrass anyone in some theatrical way, but because I think some truths only really land when they arrive without warning, the same way Gary's cruelty had always arrived without warning for me. The morning of the transition meeting, I walked into that Columbus office in a gray suit, the first genuinely nice suit I'd ever bought myself. My hair cut the way my mother used to cut my father's before he left. And I remember Marcus seeing me in the lobby and just staring, his mouth actually falling open a little. I gave him a small nod, and he understood not to say anything yet. The meeting was called for 9 a.m., all department heads required, Gary included. Renata Cole opened the meeting by introducing the new Crestpoint leadership team overseeing the transition, and when she got to me, she said, "This is Daniel Reyes, our new Senior Director of Regional Operations, who will be conducting a full leadership and performance review of this branch over the next 30 days. I watched Gary's face change in real time, that particular color a person's face goes when their body understands something before their mind has fully caught up. He said my name out loud, quietly, almost like a question. "Daniel Reyes?" I said, "Good morning, Gary. It's good to see you again." And that was it. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to because the room had already understood everything it needed to understand just from the look on his face. The audit took 26 days. I want to be clear about something because this matters to me. I didn't go looking to destroy Gary Holloway out of anger. I conducted that audit exactly the way I would have conducted it for any branch, with total professionalism because I understood that whatever I found needed to hold up, not just to me, but to Crestpoint's legal and HR teams, to be taken seriously as fact rather than dismissed as a grudge. What I found didn't need exaggeration. Gary had submitted at least 4 cost-saving proposals to headquarters over 3 years that matched almost word for word in places, work product that predated his involvement, some of it mine, some of it Frank Delgado's from years earlier that Gary had apparently recycled without knowing Frank and I had stayed in touch. He had approved 2 vendor contracts with a shipping broker that, on paper, looked routine, but on closer inspection connected back to a company partly owned by his brother-in-law, a conflict of interest he'd never disclosed. And Tyler, 26 years old, 18 months of experience, had been signed off on operational reports he'd never actually reviewed, his signature added by an assistant at Gary's direction, which is the kind of thing that sounds small until you realize it means nobody with real oversight had actually been checking whether shipments were safe, on time, or even properly insured for over a year. I documented every finding the way Frank had taught me to read a contract 9 years earlier, carefully, patiently, looking for the sentence that could cost somebody everything. Some nights during that audit, I'd sit in a conference room long after everyone else had gone home, cross-referencing old invoices against shipment logs, and I'd catch myself thinking about the version of me who used to build proposals at his kitchen table on weekends, never imagining those same documents would someday be evidence. There was one afternoon I found an email, 3 years old, where Gary had actually forwarded one of Frank's old cost reduction memos to himself with the subject line changed, stripping Frank's name out of the file properties before presenting it as his own the following month. Seeing Frank's original formatting still buried in the metadata felt like finding an old photograph of somebody you thought had disappeared without a trace. I brought a printed copy of that file home and sat with it at my mother's kitchen table one evening, not saying much, just turning it over in my hands. She asked what was wrong, and I told her, and she said something I've held on to since. Facts don't need your anger to be true, Danny. They just need you to write them down correctly and hand them to somebody who will actually read them. So that's what I did. Then I submitted the full report to Renata Cole and to Crest Point's legal department, and I stepped back because, from that point forward, it wasn't my decision anymore. It was the truth's decision.
Gary was placed on administrative leave within a week of the report's submission and terminated for cause a little over a month later. Following what I understand was a fairly thorough internal investigation into the vendor conflict of interest, which I'm told is still being reviewed by Crest Point's compliance team even now. Tyler resigned before he could be formally let go, and Marcus told me later he'd heard Tyler moved back in with his parents in Cincinnati. I felt something when I heard that, and it wasn't joy exactly. It was something closer to a long exhale, like I'd been holding a breath for years without realizing it. The truth came out to the whole office gradually, the way truth usually does. Not in one dramatic announcement, but in pieces, in hallway conversations. In the way people started treating Marcus and a few other longtime employees differently, once they understood who had actually been keeping that branch running for the better part of a decade. Patricia knew Yen, who'd worked in HR the whole time and had quietly suspected things weren't right but never had proof, told me over coffee a few weeks later that she'd kept a small file of her own, informal notes about complaints she couldn't substantiate at the time. She said, "I always wondered if somebody like you would eventually come along with the paperwork to back it up." I told her I understood exactly what she meant. I want to ask you something else, because I think this is where a lot of these stories either become satisfying or become hollow. And I want to know what you think. Once the truth came out and Gary was gone, do you think justice like that actually heals a person, or does the wound just stay there quieter than before? I've thought about that question more than almost anything else in this whole experience. So tell me honestly in the comments, because I think the answer is different for everyone. Here's where I landed, for whatever it's worth. In the months after Gary was let go, I didn't take his old office. Not at first. I asked Renata if I could instead spend time restructuring the branch's leadership from the ground up, promoting people who'd actually been doing the work quietly for years without ever getting the credit. Marcus became regional operations manager, a role he deserved long before I ever got the chance to make it happen. Patricia was given a seat on a compliance committee that Crest Point was forming specifically because of what our audit had uncovered, so that whatever happened at that branch couldn't quietly happen again somewhere else. I called Frank Delgado and told him everything, start to finish, and he was quiet on the phone for a long moment before he said, "I knew you had it in you, Reyes. I just didn't know it would take this particular shape." I told him I didn't either. My mother, when I finally sat her down and told her the whole story, start to finish, didn't celebrate the way I expected her to. Just held my hand across her kitchen table, the same table where I used to do homework as a kid while she counted diner tips into little stacks. And she said, "You didn't do this out of hate, Danny. You did it because you finally believed you deserved better." That's the part I'm proud of. I think that's the truest thing anyone said to me through this entire experience. I still think about Gary sometimes, not with anger anymore, more with a strange kind of distance. The way you think about weather from a storm that's already passed through. I heard through people who still talk that he's working in a smaller logistics role 2 states over, so that he doesn't manage anyone directly anymore. I don't know if that's true. I don't spend much time checking. What I do know is that 9 years of being underestimated taught me something Gary never had to learn the hard way, that the people who work quietly, who write everything down, who keep showing up even when nobody's applauding, are usually the ones building something that outlasts the people standing in front of them, taking the credit. There was one afternoon, maybe 2 months after everything settled, when Tyler actually reached out to me directly, through a message on LinkedIn of all places. He didn't ask for his job back, just said he was sorry, that he'd known some of what his uncle was doing wasn't right, and that he'd been too afraid of disappointing his family to say anything at the time. I thought about not answering for a few days. In the end, I wrote back one line that I hoped he'd build whatever came next on his own name instead of somebody else's signature. I never heard from him again after that, and I don't know if the message landed the way I meant it, but I felt lighter having sent it than I would have felt ignoring it. I also want to tell you about the day I finally cleared out my old desk from the Whitfield side of the building, the one I'd sat at for 9 years before any of this happened. Facilities had boxed most of it up already, but I went through it myself anyway. Piece by piece, old client folders, a chipped Ohio State mug my mother had given me the year I got the job, a sticky note in Frank Delgado's handwriting that just said, "You've got the instincts," that I'd kept taped inside a drawer for 4 years without ever mentioning it to anyone. I sat there for a long time holding that sticky note before I put it in my wallet where it still sits today, a little worn at the corners now. Marcus and I still get lunch most Fridays. Same diner-style place, 2 blocks from the office, and sometimes we don't talk about work at all. Just about his kid's soccer schedule or whatever game happened over the weekend. I think that's part of healing too, honestly. Not every conversation after a hard chapter needs to be about the hard chapter. Some of it is just getting to have normal Fridays again, the kind where nobody's checking their phone while they decide whether your 9 years mattered. These days I sit in an office 2 floors above where Gary used to sit, though I moved my desk near the window on purpose, because I remember what it felt like to be the person who never got the good light. My mother retired from the diner last spring, and I bought her a small house outside Dayton with a porch she'd wanted her whole life. In some evenings I drive down just to sit with her out there and not talk about work at all. I think that's really what all of this was for in the end. Not the title, not the office, not even the satisfaction of watching the truth catch up to somebody who thought he'd outrun it. It was for that porch, and that quiet, and the chance to finally believe my mother had been right all along. The world doesn't owe you anything, but it does eventually notice who's been telling the truth the whole time. So let me ask you one last time before you go. What would you have done in my position? Would you have taken the job at Crest Point and let the audit speak for itself, the way I did? Or would you have confronted Gary directly the moment you had the power to do it? I want to hear your answer below, honestly, because I think it says something real about how each of us defines justice. If this story touched you the way I hope it did, do me a favor and like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with somebody in your life who's ever felt underestimated by someone who didn't deserve the chair they were sitting in. But if you want another story like this one, go check out the one I posted right before this. It's about a woman who spent 15 years being told she wasn't good enough for her family's business until the day she found out she was the only one who actually owned it. I think you'll like where that one goes. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. See you in the next one.